Hi, everybody. This is Tom Simmons and the Priest in the Hot Seat podcast. We've been looking at Charles Murray's book, Taking Religion Seriously. And our basic approach here is we want to learn from him how to increase our confidence and clarity with the gospel. Now, Christians are called to deepen our faith in Jesus and to share that faith with others with confidence and clarity. But in both of these callings, we often face a little bit of blowback from the skepticism of our society, making us doubt our faith sometimes, and oftentimes making us gun-shy when sharing it. Now, Charles Murray distilled that skepticism very well, I think, in what he calls the secular creed. It's on page 21 of his book, Taking Religion Seriously, and he writes the creed. I'll quote it at length. The concept of a personal God is at odds with everything that science has taught us over the 5 centuries. Earth is a nondescript planet on the edge of a nondescript galaxy in a universe with billions of galaxies. Humans are animals, different from other animals in our level of consciousness and intelligence, but evolved from the same primitive life forms and subject to the same laws of biology and physics. Our thoughts and emotions are products of the brain. When the brain stops, consciousness stops too. The great religious traditions are human inventions, natural products of fear of death. That includes Christianity, which can call on no solid evidence for its implausible claims. The moral teachings attributed to Jesus are admirable, but many of them resemble other influential teachings drawn from Western and Eastern traditions. The secular creed. Now, I'm sure we are familiar with this creed from different sources in our lives. We learned it back in school, right? We hear it echoed in the culture around us. We encounter it in many of our friends, and we probably hold to parts of it in our own hearts and minds. To deal with this creed, we need to understand, I think, where it comes from. So let's dive into some historical background here. This creed has dominated the 20th century that I grew up in, relegating God and Christian faith to the realm of private opinion and practice. It's like, that's nice for you. I'm glad you have that, but you can just keep that to yourself. Though it's a 20th century phenomenon for the most part, this agenda started back in the 1600s. When European elites in academia and government began looking for something other than the Christian faith as a foundation for society and culture. And why would they do that? Well, in their background of the 30 Years' War between Catholic and Protestant powers in Europe in the early 1600s, and of the English Civil War, which was waged between the High Church Anglicans and the Presbyterian and Puritan forces, that war in the mid-1600s convinced many that these kinds of sectarian conflicts were just unsustainable. You can't have society, you can't have civilization when Catholics and Protestants and rival denominations are fighting each other for power. So they started looking for a belief system to replace Christianity and confessional in its different forms of confession as the foundation of Western societies. We call it, the Enlightenment. In the 1600s and 1700s, lots of people looking for ways of knowing and relating and organizing society in a new way, in a different way, in a way that won't result in so many wars and conflicts. They look to things like rationalism, and René Descartes was famous for that, to empiricism, relying on scientific data like Locke and Hume, They thought of Romanticism, where we express the nobility of the human heart and creativity in nature, like William Wordsworth. Folks, if you like the Priest in the Hot Seat podcast, I ask you to do two things. One, send it to a friend, because that's how these things go viral. And two is, if you have a question that you'd like me to try to answer, then put it in the comment section below. Thanks, and I'm really glad to have you here. The agenda here was to unshackle these disciplines from dogmas of the past, Christianity, to harness these ways of knowing to forge a new society. And some of these ideas, of course, influenced the American Revolution, particularly from John Locke. And they struck with full force a little bit later in the late 1700s with the Jacobins of the French Revolution. And of course, we know the story of the French Revolution. They ended up tossing Christianity aside entirely, and in a great torrent of terror and blood. And one of the French revolutionary philosophers described it best. They were hoping to, it's such a vivid image here, strangle the last king with the entrails of the last priest. The French Revolution ended up casting aside the calendar that we associate with, our calendar, which originated in Rome and was Christianized. They cast that aside for a new calendar, a natural calendar based on a 10-day week. And they tried to create an entirely new society based on the cult of reason and nationalism. And it didn't work all that well. It ended up bringing Napoleon to the world stage, but that didn't keep them from persisting with revolutionary movements through the 1800s. Of course, Marx rose in that era of foment, and his ideas culminated in the Russian Revolution following the First World War. And of course, in the 20th century, there were multiple hybrid spin-off revolutionary totalitarian ideologies like fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, a host of post-colonial communist revolutionary uprisings in Africa and Asia, all around the world after World War II. And in the Western secular democracies, we faced 70 years of communist propaganda against the old Christendom in Western Europe and the United States, a sustained, unbroken assault of propaganda trying to divide and demoralize and undermine the legitimacy of our constitutional order, kind of that Western classical liberalism and free market world, and trying to destroy the influence of Western Europe and the United States in the world. In fact, I think probably most everything we hear these days about the U.S. being built on slavery and genocide, on stolen land and the oppression of women, it all pretty much began as Soviet propaganda peddled by the KGB starting back in the 1930s. Now, the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, in the 1990s, but the propaganda evidently lives on, and I think we're seeing kind of the crazy end state now in the 2020s of American Marxism in the last decades of its life here. Its hatred, its irrationality, its amazing hypocrisy and the chaos and the unneighborliness that it fosters are increasingly obvious to more and more people. And I think what we're seeing is the secular project of the late 19th and 20th centuries it's kind of unraveling. like in real time in our day. And I think that Murray's own personal journey of moving off of what he calls dead center, this secular creed, is a sign of that unraveling. He, like many in our society in the last 100 years, they simply accepted that secular creed almost as if by faith. Here's how he described his own embrace of that secular creed. He said, I had not investigated the factual validity of any of those propositions. They were part of the received wisdom of most Western intellectuals through the 20th century. I accepted them without thinking. From college, his graduate education, most everybody he knew embraced it, and so he naturally did too. So just think of all the people out there who embrace it in the same way. It's instructive to see what moved him off of that dead center, just kind of blind acceptance of the secular creed. For him, real life intruded, and that came in the form of the first child that he and his wife Catherine had. Charles Murray relates how soon after the birth of that child, it dawned on Catherine that she loved this child, as she said, more than evolution requires. Now, what does that mean? Of course, in the secular creed, there is no God creating us in his image. The only way to explain human behavior is with evolutionary biology, in which every human action is an expression of the quest to survive. It's Darwin's survival of the fittest. So a mother, in this view, loves her child because that increases the likelihood of this child's survival, the propagation of the genes of the family and of the human species in the world. But Catherine realized in those early months of caring for this newborn, she realized that she was feeling a lot more love than that child's survival required. She loved this child way more than was needed for that child to survive. So she realized that this evolutionary biological explanation, well, it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain love, the love of a mother for her child. Well, then what does? Catherine experienced herself as a mother being a conduit for a greater love, a love that's bigger than she realized she had. But whose love is that? That question pointed her in a vague way to God. It was the first step. And you'll read in Charles Murray's book the rest of the story, the rest of the steps from that to embracing Christian faith. And it's a great story. I recommend the book, Taking Religion Seriously by Charles Murray. And we'll have a few more episodes in which we walk our way through it together. Now, if you like this episode, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell so that you know the next time we drop a Priest in the Hot Seat episode. And help us make this thing go viral by sending it to your friends. Thanks, and God bless you.